Muy buenos días, amigas y amigos. Estamos muy contentos esta mañana de tener nuestro seminario. Hoy nos acompaña una extraordinaria académica que tiene un prestigio y un reconocimiento internacional muy grande. Y bueno, pues es un honor que nos esté acompañando aquí la doctora Pahl. Ella es profesora de Artes y Literacidad en la Universidad Metropolitana de Manchester, en Reino Unido. Es autora, junto con Jennifer Russell, de el libro Literacidades Vivas, Literacidad para el Cambio Social, que publicaron en 2020. Ha realizado muchos proyectos de investigación en hogares y comunidades, explorando las formas en que se experimentan las literacidades en la vida cotidiana, centrándose en los fondos de conocimiento multilingües y multimodales. Actualmente es la investigadora principal del proyecto Voces del Futuro, que explora los encuentros cotidianos de niños y jóvenes con Treescapes. Estamos muy contentos de poderla escuchar. Es un enorme privilegio para este seminario de Innovación Educativa, Liderazgo y Literacidad del Instituto Transdisciplinar en Literacidad de la Universidad de Guadalajara, por esta trayectoria, y ya estamos ansiosos de escucharla, doctora Kate. Bienvenida, el micrófono es suyo, adelante.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chavez, and I'd like to say a very warm welcome to everybody. I really was delighted when I got this invitation, because for me, I learn through encounters and discussions with all of you, and I feel like I will learn by doing this talk. And I hope that I'm not going too quickly, that everyone can hear, because we're doing a simultaneous translation into Spanish, and I'm sorry that I can't speak in Spanish. My daughter speaks Spanish, but I don't. But anyway, thank you for coming to my talk. And also, I teach an MA class in quite a similar class called the MA in Literacies, Life and Identity. And I'm really, really interested in all of this work. So, and I'd be interested to actually follow what you're doing in Mexico. So I'm going to share my screen now. I'm going to see if that works. And let me know if there's a problem. Also, there is the chat where people can put comments in English, though, and also we'll have time for discussion. I'm going to talk for probably just under an hour, and I do hope that it's clear, because I really wanted this to be clear. Can everyone see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the work that I did with Jennifer Rousel, which was called Living Literacies. But we're going to go on a journey of the ways in which I approach this topic. And so what you're going to do is get a story of my journey and my journey through the field of social cultural literacy research. And I'll try and keep slow so you have time to think, and I will give you these slides later. So if you can't understand anything, hopefully it'll be in the slides. So one of the things that for me is very important, and I think this is really my reason to do my studies, is this idea of rethinking what literacy is. And I think we need new ways of recognizing what literacy is and how it can be harnessed to meet the demands of everyday life. Because as everybody knows, life is changing. We've just had a major pandemic. We have a climate crisis. We need literacy to respond to that. This, I argue, requires new ways of knowing and making that make it possible for young people to reposition their learning and understanding. Most of my work is about young people and the importance of listening to young people. But central to these new ways is an expansive and nuanced understanding of what literacy could become. So this idea of literacy in a state of becoming. And I argue that that involves a methodology which is a collaborative ethnographic approach, exploring literacy with communities. So this is what I'm going to discuss today, is I'm going to talk about what literacy could be and what literacy could become. I'll move to the next slide, and I hope this is not too quick because I'm anxious. Okay, so where I began, where I started in my work, and this was quite a while ago now, I was really interested in the everyday, in local literacies, and how in homes and communities people did everyday things like shopping, cooking, speaking in different languages, making things, just everyday literacies. And I thought that ethnographic methods often could capture those everyday literacies because they were about participating in everyday life. I was interested in how literacy happened in the community, so I worked a lot with libraries and also in schools, and also looked at intergenerational literacies, grandparents and parents and children, and this idea of literacy sponsors, that literacy needs to have people as well as practices. And then I looked at community literacies and how literacy in a community could become attached to certain kinds of knowledge and ideas. And to do that, we needed to have ethnographers who were from the community. So we did a collaborative ethnography. And from there, we changed our definitions of literacy to become community definitions of literacy. And from those ideas, we got to these ideas: literacy as material, artifactual literacies, and living literacies. So that's the journey that I've been on, and it's been a while. So you're going to get my journey on this talk. So we'll move on. So these are a few little pieces of a living literacies approach, which is really about where literacy is in people's lives. So you can see on the top left-hand corner, there's a slide with a picture of a young person, and in writing, it says, "We would have shown you our faces as young people. We feel that we are nothing but shadows to the government." And in that project, the young people they used puppets to make a story about how they didn't feel listened to. And they wrote that on a film. In the left-hand corner, you've got a story that was constructed by a group of teenagers, which says, "Does money make you happy or sad? Now's the time to decide yes or no." Again, that was a Lift the Flap book in the library, which they changed. In the middle was a small purse that was made in a home with a small labels saying "Top Secret, Keep Out." In the top right hand, you have a story making project, which was about going through a special portal called Portals to the Past and telling a story. And then on the bottom right, you have a Union Jack, which has many, many nationalities writing within it, from Pakistan, Roma heritage communities, and it's about identity. So that for me is a living literacies approach. So my journey, I started with this idea that literacy was about writing, it's about language and culture. And I thought I was trying to look at them as terms that could be identified within the shifting sands of observation. But where I finished was in a space where writing just singly about these phenomena was less possible, as the ownership of concepts, ideas, and research thinking on literacy and language became shared and co-constructed. So I shared my ideas with the people that I work with. And I think that really started with this idea of local literacies. So the concept of local literacies has been defined in relation to close and sustained ethnographic study of and with communities. For example, you might have read Shirley Bryce Heath's Ways with Words, which looked at the ways in which literacy was practiced in different communities, including Black communities in the Carolinas and the white rural communities. But one of the big recognitions was that school literacy was only one kind of literacy, and many other linguistic ways with words were coexisting within communities without being recognized within schools. And I was always really interested in the hidden literacies within communities. So when I was thinking about literacy, I was really interested in this concept of literacy practices, and you've probably been reading Brian Street's work and Shirley Bryce Heath's work, in their descriptions of everyday patterned practices in everyday life. And also you might have heard of the term literacy events to describe an event where literacy has a part, and this idea of the unfolding of literacy practices. And as a researcher, this gave me a lens from which to explore the ways in which literacy practices move and develop over time and space. And I actually did a study with these young people. The picture on the left is young people doing a study of their literacy practices. And you can see a bus ticket They thought about what their practices were, and they went on the bus from home to school, and also they went shopping, and they just put all the different things that they did into this tapestry of literacy practices. So this is of a very early picture that I took in a home, and it's of a map which was made of beads, and it was actually a child's map of his countries that he went to, and he came from Turkey, so that's actually a map of Turkey. And one of the things that happens when you go into homes is that you see that literacy is part of a much broader thing, which could include print, but also includes these shapes. So ethnographic exploration understands that literacy is a fluid genre, a social process, and this is from Gunter Kress's work. It connects with all the hurly-burly and messiness of life in the midst of social processes and cultural values and demands. And I like this idea of literacy connecting with the hurly-burly and messiness of life. And I think the concepts of literacy practices and literacy events are useful to describe the unfolding of literacy practices in time. So you can use that as a lens to explore the ways in which those practices move and develop over time and space. So this is all where I started, really. You're getting my early work here. One of the things I was interested in is how people understood literacy who come from the community themselves. And this is a piece of it's a bunting with a little expression in the local dialect of Rotherham, "I'll have your guts for garters," and it was written phonetically, so it isn't English that's recognized, but it's about this idea of what local language is. So when we did collaborative ethnography, as you know, is a practice of inscribing local practice into texts, but local literacy practices, stories, proverbs often remain hidden, and they're often shaped by histories and cultures. And so collaborative ethnography enables an approach that enables researchers to collaboratively develop research questions with participants. And rather than researching on people, you work with people as co-researchers. And this was a big shift for me, to kind of have co-research people working alongside me in my projects. So this is a story that Brian Street told me years ago, and I just like it. I still like it. The story of the turtle and the fish. It comes from his book, in the Naranta book, but it actually is taken from a Buddhist story. There was once a turtle that lived in a lake with a group of fish. One day the turtle went for a walk on dry land. He was away from the lake for a few weeks. When he returned, he met some of the fish. The fish asked him, "Mr. Turtle, hello, how are you? We have not seen you for a few weeks. Where have you been?" The turtle said, "I was spending some time on dry land." The fish were a little puzzled, and they said, "Up on dry land? What are you talking about? What is this dry land? Is it wet?" The turtle said, "No, it's not." "Is it cool and refreshing?" "No, it's not." "Can you swim in it?" "No, you can't." The fish said, "It's not wet, it's not cool, there are no waves, you can't swim in it." "Don't tell us what it's not, tell us what it is." "I can't," said the turtle, "I don't have any language to describe it." And for me, that story really is about educators often saying there are no literacy in homes, where there's a lot of literacy, but it doesn't look like literacy. It might look like something very different. And part of it is to find the language for what literacy is. So as the research developed, I began to think about literacy and language practices differently. Thinking was shared and came from many different places. Within collaborative research, ideas flowed through conversations, collaborations, ways of understanding the world. And these conversations often came from meeting in a site, such as a community library, or drinking tea in a home. They didn't necessarily happen in school, they happened in community contexts. So one of the things I've been interested in is different collaborative studies of community literacy practices, which have been developed with communities as co-researchers and co-writers. And Larson and Moses described their story of a study of a community literacy initiative in a grocery store in upstate New York through co-writing and co-analysis. And Campbell and me and my colleagues produced a co-produced written account of one community, Rotherham. So this idea of writing with communities about literacy is where I've started to develop my work. So one of the things that's really interesting if you start to co-research is you start to see literacy through different eyes. So this is from one of my co-researchers who sent me an email a long time ago. I was asking about the materiality in the home, and she said, the textile side of our heritage comes from the women in the family. We have older relatives that do applique, crochet, embroidery, sewing and knitting. From the girls' mother's side, their grandmother's sister and cousin, and from their father's side, his two cousins who live close by. My younger sister loves craft type of activities and buys the girls a lot of resources to do sewing and fabric work, especially on birthdays, Christmas and Eid. And there is a little tapestry. It's a sampler made by one of the children in that family, which of course has writing on it. And it says Sarah. So one of the things that I started to think about is how do we find a living literacy approach? How do we look at how literacies were lived and experienced with people? And I started to look at how the construction of the data was produced within experience and within sites and space. So this was not a model of research that took data from a site, but instead produced it within a site as a co-production. And the co-production process included co-analysis and co-inquiry as projects were developed in collaboration with community researchers. And I'm still doing that today. In fact, next Saturday, I'm going to be working in a library, Manchester Poetry Library, co-analysing a zine project with a group of students. So this idea of co-analysis was very important to me and still is. So one of the things we've written about, myself and Jennifer Rousel, is this idea of artifactual literacies. And I argue that literacy as a term can be used to describe communicational practices that include oral, written and crafted multimodal texts. And that comes from the work of Ruth Finnegan. But in the poems, you can see there's a multimodal text. It's got a name, it's got a glitter word, superstar, and it's very decorated. And this idea of the text as just part of something bigger is really important for this idea of literacy. It's an expanded view of literacy, which recognizes how literacies themselves are multimodal. And that comes from the work of Rosie Fluett. I also think, just as an aside, they're multilingual as well. And I think multilingualism is really important within this. And these literacies incorporate materially situated literacies within objects and in relation to material culture. So in the Artifactual Literacies book, I talked about how literacies were both themselves material, but they were linked to objects. They were linked to objects that then told stories. So when we wrote our Living Literacies book, we tried to explain this idea of a living literacies approach that sees that literacy is porous and a lived practice. And we had these ways of looking at literacy, which were these different lenses. So we started with seeing, because seeing is a very visual and immediate way in to literacy and into stories. We then moved to disrupting, and we talked about the literacies of disruption, of activism, and that's got more important recently, but also ways of thinking around activist literacies, protest literacies. We then looked at hope and hopeful literacies, and we looked at literacies of the not yet and the literacy event as something that was about to come. And then we explored knowing and the ways in which families know and children know through family intergenerational practices. We then looked at creating, we looked at how creativity is bound up with literacy, and literacy is a creative act. And finally, making, and the idea of the makerspace and digital making, which is Jennifer Rousel's work. And this really is a way of describing literacy as a much more expansive concept, something that belongs in different places. So one of the things about the lived literacies work is that it starts to open out some new conceptual framings. And on the left, you can see a drawing by a Turkish boy, which says, the English says bird, and then kush, which is Turkish. And the child is described in the nest as the baby bird. And there's something about the link between the language and the drawing that's very interesting. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the participant-led ideas about literacy. How does that child see literacy? And you can see in the middle is crossed out gosh, which is the phonetic spelling of kush for bird. And that child is figuring out ways of describing literacy. I also think that co-production as a methodology can produce a collaborative understanding of literacy. I've worked a lot with time in literacy studies, of time in families, so looking back over family time and grandparent time and parent time, but also ways of knowing through time. So time being something that I've worked with Catherine Compton-Lilly's work on reading families and what happens over time as reading is developed. I've worked a lot with space and communities and thinking about community literacies and walking communities and looking at the literacies in the street, and also developed that to look at power within literacy studies and who names literacy and why, and then looking at affect and emotion. So this idea that literacy is an affective experience, it's not just something that's about writing, it's actually something that you can feel. So these are beginning the themes of the lived literacy work. So one of the things that you do is you start to think differently about how you collect data. And this is very challenging, actually, is that we as researchers often think, well, we go into a site and you collect some data and then you analyze it. But if you do that with communities, it looks different. So in our book, we write that literacy looks different wherever you look in the data. These competing analyses were also collaboratively constructed and reflexively analysed. The literacies were lived and experienced with people, and the construction of the data was produced in experience and within sites and space. This was not a model of research that took data from a site, but instead produced it within a site as a co-production. And one of my colleagues on the project that I was doing in Rotherham, she talked about the literacies of school gates, and how on the school gates, when you pick up your children, there are these literacy practices that are unobserved. So you might be swapping information about where to get cheap food or how to survive. And those survival literacies are being swapped all the time in the everyday. So a living literacies approach has these qualities. And I think one of the things I'm really interested in is what, if you do this work, what then happens to the work? So it starts with literacy from the ground up. That means following and being with communities as they go to school, drop their children, and also seeing the literacies that go between schools, so children going from home to school. I always thought that people didn't realise that children travelled from home to school. Parents are in the home and the teachers are in the home, but the children go in between. So what happens when you follow children between home and school, and how do they understand home and school? And how do they match their literacies at home, which might be multilingual, and the literacies at school, which might be just Spanish and English or just one monolingual? But also the living literacies approach recognises the ways of knowing that participants take with them. So the participants might think that linguistically their knowledge is in different kinds of knowing. So whether it's in a religious context or within the knowing of the home, that they might have knowledge in the home that isn't passed to the school. And I think that's always really interesting. So it's this idea of expansive methodologies. I very much encourage the researchers I work to look at drawing, writing, storying, jumping around, following children's lead in a way, and following what they do, and then trying to make sense of them. And from this comes the theory. And I believe in kind of mid-level theory building, when you start from the ground and you think, what's going on here? And you develop your theory as you watch children and as they help you understand what happens. And then this knowledge that resides within families, and it's drawing on the funds of knowledge work from Louis Small, but also thinking about knowledge as something that actually exists that we can develop through the research. And also using the idea of languaging from Pahl, that young people are growing up in these multilingual households and they're swapping and crossing and translanguaging, and that's a very active practice. And from Brian Street's idea of culture as a verb, that you're remaking literacy in the process of doing it. So literacy is constantly being changed as it's being developed. So living literacy is and involves, it's porous. And I think this is something that we're still researching really. I think it crosses people and technologies. So if you watch any children, they're working across their phones and they might be working across different platforms. It works in different contexts. It works across home and school, and also might work in other contexts like religious contexts and youth contexts, which are outside adults. It works across cultures. There's quite a strong literature on how crossing cultures and the idea of transcultural work happens in literacy studies. Across languages, and there's a strong literature on translanguaging and spaces, the idea of the spatial approach to literacies, and there's a kind of ecological approach you can take to understanding literacies spatially. I think a living literacies approach is sociocultural, so it's drawing on anthropology and ethnography as a way of knowing about what's happening. It's important to recognise that the research is very limited and quite biased, I think, often, to only see certain kinds of literacy practices. So that's really important, that's seeing from different perspectives. I also think that more recently we've been working with ideas of entanglement, looking at stuff, whether it's matter and objects, but also the interaction between the object and literacy practice. So for instance, the work of Candice Cuby in thinking about her writing studio is all about the relationship between objects and children, and literacy being built through that interaction. Karen Barad. We've also been working around affective intensities, so work on affect by people like Christian Ehret has developed understandings of where you feel your literacies, and also the political and activist aspect of literacies, this idea of literacies as at the school gates and becoming, and literacy as a creative act. And I talked about this earlier. It's this idea of literacy coming into being. So the literacy event, as you do it, it's recreating what literacy is. It's always new. There's always a transformationary process. And we often find that difficult because there's a settledness about many practices. You make notes, you write notes, you do things in a certain way, but literacy is still remade through the act of doing, I think. So I'm just going to talk for a little bit about a project that I'm currently doing, which is kind of related to a living literacies approach. The project is called Voices of the Future, and it's a 3-year project. It's exploring children and young people's effective engagement with treescapes. And by treescapes, we mean urban as well as rural schools. And we also mean parks, we mean city trees, we mean all kinds of trees. So any kind of tree, not just forests. And we're working in multilingual schools in Manchester, as well as in Aberdeen and Sheffield and other sites. And our work is very much around tree planting in the school grounds and embedding this knowledge into science activities so young people can learn about and get ready for tree planting. And one of the things we're trying to do is bring the science into the literacy work, so bring them together. And we're trying to create, we're not trying to create a new knowledge. Sorry, that doesn't make sense. Our aim is to create new knowledge about woodland ecology and urban trees in collaboration with and by young people in the schools and communities. So we are working with scientists to think differently about ecology. But nested within that is a living literacies approach, which entwines stories of hope, embodied knowledge of treescapes and drawings, and oral stories and writing. And this is where we've applied a living literacies approach to the Treescapes project. So we actually go into schools at the moment, we're doing this, and we ask them to tell stories of what they know about trees. We ask them to create plans of where the trees will be and what the trees will look like. And we ask them to tell us stories about hope. But then we co-analyze this with the children and young people. So we're embedding a living literacies approach into an environmental project. And one of the things about our project is that we are working with hope very strongly, and we're using a hopeful approach to think about the literacies of the environment. So this quote comes from the work of Ernst Bloch. He was an academic who worked in Germany, and he worked with utopian theory. And he says, we walk in the forest and we feel we are or could be what the forest dreams. And I would argue that a hopeful approach to literacy practices helps us to see the many threads that form webs of meaning flowing through the past into the present and into all possible futures. Researching literacy becomes concerned with the affective intensities that lie behind the surface of texts. These affective intensities can emerge in the richness and complexities of the everyday, and I'm quoting from my own work, but that's Kathleen Stewart. So this quote was really important because it's this idea of the threads flowing from intergenerational relationships between children and grandparents, parents, into the present and into the future. And then researching literacy is about that intensity that lies behind the surface of text. So it's not just seeing the text as one thing, it's seeing them as multiple. So this is taken from a piece of work that I did very recently in a classroom in Manchester. And on the left, you can see an image of 3 trees with a spider web. And you can also see lots of different pieces of planning. They're actually planning their school field, which was going to be, it has now been replanted with trees. And they put a football pitch, and they've also put lots of trees like apple tree. And they've been trying to reimagine the treescape of the future. And one of the things we've been doing is working with multimodality. So seeing these bits of writing in the drawings as connected, and also that's this very expressive literacy of the not yet. So researching creative literacies requires a multimodal, material and auditory expansive concept of literacy. And from Janet Mabin's work, we argue that the visual, gestural and oral let in much more meaning within communicational landscapes. And it's no longer possible to see language just as monomodal. And I think by situating literacy and then expanding the concept, you can then see a much broader aspect of what the children are doing. And that multimodality offers a way to see literacy as part of a wider landscape of meaning-making practices. So now when I think about literacy, I think about the feelings the children had as they were drawing those images of the treescapes in their field. But also I look at the expansiveness of their understanding of treescapes. So they have bugs like spiders' webs and little bugs at the top right. They also have trees, they also have a football pitch. They have grass and flowers, and it's this expansive notion of the tree and their literacy practices explaining that I'm really interested in. And I think as researchers, we just need to look at this broad picture, this kind of canvas of literacy. We also recorded the conversations that the children had while they were doing these drawings, and we've just written an article which has actually just gone in about this, so it went in, it's under review now. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how literacy is lived. And this quote comes from the Handbook of Literacy Studies that we're talking about at the beginning, 2015. Literacy cannot be separated from what people are doing, how they're doing it, when, where, under what conditions, and with whom they are doing it. Metaphorically, there's no separation of the dancer from the dance. And I think that really is the key, is seeing who's doing it and why, but actually not separating out those reasons to do things, and actually then seeing the literacy is embedded within that. And this image is actually from one of our conferences, from one of the participants, and it's of a bowl, which also makes a sound when you go around the bowl. This idea of the speaking bowl is quite interesting. So again, it's lived literacy, but seeing where is the literacy, where is the experiential aspect of literacy, and what is it doing? So this is really where I am at the moment, this concept of future literacies. There's the children planting the trees in the school. I think these methodologies need to open up to diversity, to modes of inquiry that are congruent with young people's choices, possibilities and understandings. And I think we're working in our project with refugee background young people and multilingual young people. And we're trying to see what they would like to do and how they would like to research. So we're doing a lot of walking around the neighborhood. We're experiencing the earth. So those young girls, I was there when I took that picture, they were very interested in the worms underneath the ground. And they were interested in what it was like to plant a tree. I think in our project, young people can then share their lived literacies by asking questions, documenting their literacies, and recognizing where literacy sits within their everyday lives. So one of the things we're trying to do is to bring knowledge that they have outside into our tree project. So we've done a lot of work with them about what their grandparents do and their parents around trees and the environment, and to document that through different means. They've been doing a lot of drawing and telling us their knowledge, really. But I think if we have a future vision of literacies, new possibilities come into play. And this provides a recognition of the effective and aesthetic shaping of everyday texts that draw on ideological and material sensibilities. So in my artifactual literacies work, the notion of the materiality of the text and the way that it's shaped. And if we think back to the text we just saw, is this idea of the shaped literacy, that shaped through the encounter with the everyday and the encounter with the trees. So seeing the trees as part of that process. And I think within a lived literacies approach, this lack of separation is really important. It also means a different kind of research practice, because we're having to co-research with young people and come back and ask them what they're doing. And the future literacies is also about where literacy is going as a field. And I would really urge you to think about the notion of literacy from your perspective. Where should it be going? We have a climate emergency. We have a lot of different stresses and strains around resources. And I think literacy is going to be important in shaping new curricula and new ways of knowing, but also recognizing what the knowledge is in communities. And I think that porousness, going back to the idea of the porous, is also very important. So I'm just going back to this concept of, yeah, there it is, of the porousness of literacies. And I think more recently, we've also been involved in the activism of literacies. We've been we did a study of people's activism, young people's activism in environmental domains, but trying to think differently about the relationalness of effective, entangled and situated literacies, and then working out the relationship between people, technologies, contexts, cultures and languages. So I think that's where I'm kind of really interested. I'm also really interested in how you do research with children and young people and how you make spaces to do that. And I'm also really interested in how you can actually document literacy practices. So these are some of the books that I've been drawing on in this talk. And I can also give you a book list of all the references. But one of the things that they tell you is the ways in which I've been thinking about literacy through the books. So some of these books you might have read, but they're thinking really about relationalness between community and literacy, and how you can learn to see the world differently through the eyes of children and young people. So the titles also give you a nice idea. So Emotions in Community Research, which is an article I wrote about co-producing research with communities. The Reimagining Contested Communities was the one that we did jointly with community members to think about communities. Learning from Ninjas was a project where we looked at young people's films as a lens for an expanding view of literacy and language. And we also looked at reflexivity in my work with Mike Grenfell, about Bourdieu and language-based ethnographies and reflexivity. And I've explored this idea of poetry as a method, again, as a way of seeing the world, trying to see the world differently, and time and space. And I've talked about that as a resource for meaning making. I'm also interested in how universities can rethink their own work, and also think about how young people's civic engagement practices can draw on new forms of literacy. And this idea of, I don't know what literacy is, uncovering hidden literacies in a community library. So these are some of the things that I've been thinking about over time. I've also been thinking about enduring narratives and texts and practices across 3 generations and the relationalness between intergenerational literacies. And I've also, as I've been talking about, been working on living literacies and materializing literacies and the aesthetics of everyday literacies and artifactual literacies. I've also written just recently a book about collaborative research and theory of practice and about no. So I kind of wanted to introduce you really to my kind of world. I think it's difficult because I feel like I don't know if I've gone too quickly and I need to go back and explain some of the concepts in this talk. Really what I'm trying to do is to ask for a more engaged mode of scholarship, so literacy becomes part of the everyday and part of our world, and then is created through that practice and understanding of literacy for the present moment. So I think I'll stop for now and then see if we've got any questions. And was that too quick? Do we want to go over some concepts?
Pues estamos muy contentos de haber tenido esta oportunidad de escuchar esta vasta experiencia de la doctora Pahl en las literacidades bajo esta concepción tan novedosa, tan abierta que se presenta. Nos gusta mucho ese enfoque acá en México porque nosotros tenemos en nuestras raíces ancestrales, por ejemplo, un sentido profundo de la amistad. Y eso es parte de lo que, de la forma como trabajamos nuestras literacidades. Tenemos un arte muy colorido y eso es otra de nuestras literacidades. Expresamos mucho a través del color. Mucha poesía prehispánica en torno al respeto a la naturaleza, el amor por la naturaleza al grado de convertirlos en deidades. El dios de la lluvia, el dios del maíz. Tenemos muchas poesías que hablan de ese agradecimiento de los habitantes de la tierra por el maíz que nos alimenta, que nos nutre, etcétera. Entonces, nosotros hemos venido viendo a las literacidades como una posibilidad de innovación educativa, porque implica hacer conciencia de la relación que tenemos entre el pensamiento, el lenguaje, cualquier lenguaje que se utilice, no solo el hablado, no solo el escrito, sino también el visual, el lenguaje de la ciudad, etcétera. Entonces, esa relación entre pensamiento, lenguaje, texto y modo en que se entrega el texto, que nos sirve para comunicar con una intención clara. Bueno, eso es lo que nos mueve mucho, por eso yo particularmente me siento muy emocionada de haber escuchado a la doctora Pahl con todos estos conceptos que nos son muy familiares, que no importa el lugar, que nos separe un océano, no importa que esté ella del otro lado del continente nuestro, hay una comunidad, una comunión de conceptos, de principios y una intención de lucha por la justicia social y por el cuidado al planeta. Entonces me sentí sumamente conmovida de ver todas estas imágenes de los niños que son una forma de expresión muy genuina de su pensamiento y también de lo que quieren comunicar. Y eso es tan valioso empezarlo a hacer desde pequeña, desde que son pequeños. Entonces, bueno, yo quiero reiterar mi agradecimiento a la doctora, invitarla a México, que venga, a que conozca nuestro instituto, nuestra comunidad, y esperamos pronto continuar con esta colaboración. Yo voy a dejarlos ahora a ustedes para esta retroalimentación, este diálogo. Con una gran disculpa, tengo que inaugurar la Semana Académica de Letras para... Entonces voy a eso, pero nuevamente muy agradecida y emocionada con esta conferencia de la doctora Pahl. Muchísimas gracias y hasta pronto.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I tried to finish before you left, so yeah, that's great. Take care.
Thank you, thank you. Bueno, hasta pronto. Se queda la doctora Mayra moderando las intervenciones. Gracias.
Gracias. Coco, tenemos una... déjame cambiar español. Tenemos una pregunta de la doctora Patti Cisneros, si puede profundizar en el concepto de etnografía colaborativa. Y a los demás asistentes también, si quieren levantar la mano o poner sus preguntas en el chat. Coco, ¿y de qué manera se puede establecer?
Was that a question about collaborative ethnography? Yeah. Yeah, so I did wonder whether I should do more on that. So it's a really good question. Thank you for the question. So the way I heard about collaborative ethnography was through, it was actually an original project in the US, and it was done by Eric Lasseter and Elizabeth Campbell and a community in Muncie, Indiana. And the project was called The Other Side of Middletown. And it was with a community where the anthropologists had gone in and just looked at the white community, and they had not looked at the African-American community. And the African-American community said, well, actually, we think that we want to do the study ourselves. So what they did is they got students to help them, and they came up with the research questions. They then came up with the methods, which was interviews and oral history, and they did co-writing with students. Now, this was really interesting to me because when I was working where I was working in the north of England, there were many accounts of the community I was working in, but not by the community. They had not been involved in actually doing the research. They just had people come in and take away. So what we did is we got funding, and we got quite a lot of funding for about 6 community researchers who were funded by the university. And they each had about £6,000 for 2 years research, which is not a lot, but it's enough to buy you out of your work. And then they decided on research questions. So they were looking at, in that project, they were interested in the cultural context of civic engagement. So Zainab Rasool, who's somebody who's done a lot of research with me, looked at the Schoolgate Literacies. She also looked at the history of women's activism. And then she created her own mini research project within the bigger project. So the community research team had their own projects, and then they decided on different methods. So we did oral history, poetry as method, that was our article. We also looked at storytelling, and we did a photography project with young people and a model making project with some residents. So we had the methods were constructed from when with the community researchers made the decisions. So this, one of them said, Zainab said, well, I need to look at the history of activism. So we did long interviews, but she did those interviews. We also had an ethics system by which the community researchers created ethics forms for the participants. So they developed ethics systems themselves, and they spoke and wrote. So they co-wrote with me and spoke at conferences. So we tried to include them at all levels of academic practice. And I think what I've tried to do with children as well, it hasn't worked so much the last 3 years because of COVID. It was less good because we couldn't go into the schools. But when we were going into the schools, we asked the children to come to our building and find out what it was to do academic practice, and then ask them to come up with ideas about what they see literacy is. But this all takes a long time. And the thing that's really hard, and I still find it hard when I do co-production and collaborative ethnography, you need extra time built into your project to do that work. It's much easier if you do it just going in and collecting data. This is a more time-consuming way of working. So yeah, that's my answer. There's a really good question in the chat as well. Shall I answer that one?
Yes, but we have a one before.
And, sorry.
And is that if you can establish the relationship between academic literacy and life.
Living literacy.
Coco, how we say, ¿cómo decimos vida cotidiana?
Living literacies.
Okay.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm doing with my students, actually, my MA students, is we're looking at our autobiographical literacies. And there's a really nice book. It's called, it's by Ros Ivanic. I'm going to put it in the chat, called Writing and Identity. And this really helped me. I'm just writing it in now. Think about the relationship between academic literacies and local literacies. It's quite old, but it's really good. So this book talks about different kinds of academic literacies. So when you're writing as an MA student, you have your autobiographical self. That's the self who tells a story of your family, of yourself, and that self goes into writing. So that's your own personal journey. So the autobiographical self is one kind of writing self. And then there's the self that cites, when you cite someone else. So you say you use other people's ideas, and that citation self is more like the kind of academic literacy self that is drawing on academic writing. But what I tried to do in the project I was talking about, the Imagine project, is to bring those two together. So Zainab Rasool, who I work with, herself was a British Asian woman and observed everyday literacies, but she also crossed over into writing. And some of the time what we would do is we'd audio tape discussions. So the emotions article was done through an audio tape discussion. But it's also about integrating the theory from the on the ground. So we used a lot of funds of knowledge, we used a lot of critical race theory, we used different theories, and the community researchers would engage with those different theories, but on their different terms. So they might say, well, actually, this means something to me personally. The thing that's difficult, and this is where I do struggle, is when you have very high level theories, so Deleuze and Guattari, or really difficult theory that's very complex, new materialism, speculative stuff like that, which is quite fashionable in my unit, my research unit. People find that quite difficult to understand, whereas actually critical race theory, funds of knowledge, those kind of theoretical ideas make sense in community context, because funds of knowledge, everybody has an understanding of that. They can carry that. Critical race theory, we worked a lot with. Those kind of, so it's kind of this idea of mid-level theory building, where you build your theory from the ground. But also you don't get too worried if your theory, you don't have too much theory. So in our book about collaborative research, we wrote about this idea of theory as worldizing. So it's like the sound of a car radio going in and out of your car as you're driving along. So sometimes it's really useful, the theory, and sometimes it's not so useful. And so with community co-writers, you think, well, is this going to be useful to have a bit of theory? So that's a very long answer. But it was very hard to put those two together at the beginning, and I had to find lots of ways in which people could find academic words accessible and academic writing accessible. So we used to do a lot of discussion as well of academic ideas, but also bring them into the community and say, do they work in this community?
Thank you. And now the question of Erica. And she wonders, what are some implications of your research work for classroom teachers?
So at the moment, that's such a good question, Erica. We're working in several schools in Manchester, Greater Manchester, and the classroom teachers are very tight curriculum. But what we do find is if we do we've been going into schools and running the tree sessions and looking at trees and hope and doing the tree planting. What the classroom teachers say is that this expansive view opens up a lot more. So the children tell stories a lot more, and also they let in more imagination into the classroom. I think the difficulty is having that kind of okay from the kind of Ofsted and from our Department for Education, but we actually have a new initiative in the UK which is called the Nature Park Initiative, which is encouraging teachers and schools to get more involved in the environmental things. And we are hoping that through that initiative, the work of the children in co-researching the literacies, the living literacies, will be more valued, because it's actually, for us, it's about the environment at the moment. So I think it's about really doing the work and then arguing the case for why this expansive view of literacy actually also creates more opportunities to do literacy in a broader sense, but it's linked to sustainability in the environment. That's our way through at the moment. It's tough because schools are very narrow, but I think it's arguing for why we need to do these expansive concepts. It's also about the world we live in. We have to shift to account for that world, and living literacy's approach does that.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to change to the Spanish channel. ¿Hay alguien que tenga alguna otra pregunta? ¿No? Bueno, entonces Coco me traduce. Bueno, pues parece ser que ya no hay más preguntas, ¿no? A mí me parece súper interesante la cuestión de la materialidad, ¿no? De la literacidad, porque justamente es como muy difícil de aprender, pero como ya lo decías, es un poco difícil de entender, ¿no? Quizás habría que profundizar un poco más en esta cuestión para poder comprender como hasta dónde podríamos, ¿no? Tener estas literacidades de forma más materiales, porque sí es como un concepto muy abstracto, ¿no? Que después es difícil de entender. Pero si ya no hay más preguntas, pues te quisiéramos agradecer, ¿no? Por venir, estar aquí, compartirnos todo tu conocimiento, el PowerPoint. Mira, aquí tenemos otro comentario. Entonces, Coco, si lo puedes traducir, por favor. Sí. No, no te creas. Entonces, más bien yo lo traduzco. Que Hazel dice que, es que está en inglés, ama las actividades que escribió en el libro en la Isla del Tesoro, y está de acuerdo en que la librería, más bien la biblioteca, es algo que todo el mundo necesita sobrevivir. Internet, los libros, las computadoras, el café, además de la percepción de los niños de que la librería es un espacio seguro, acogedor. Entonces, este es más bien un comentario de Hazel para la doctora Kate. Bueno, entonces...
Yeah,
sí.
I completely agree, Hazel. I think that one of the things we need to do is to find library spaces everywhere. And I think I was just at the weekend at a concert in a church, and there was a community library in the church. And I think we're going to have to find these small spaces where we can create these warm environments, because I don't know about you, but in the UK we have a real problem with the cold and the energy crisis. And so the libraries are one of the spaces which are actually warm. So that's really, really important as well. And that's what a lot of the children come for, is the warmth, and also the fact that they can study. But the children perceive the library as a safe space. I think that's really, really important. There's a hand up somewhere.
Bueno, ahorita que están hablando de esto, Coco, si lo puedes decir, tenemos un proyecto aquí en el Litrali, en el Instituto Transdisciplinar en Literacidad, que se llama Mundos Ideales. Y se trata justo de saber los mundos ideales de los niños a partir de representaciones visuales y pequeñas historias. Entonces, ahorita están con tu conferencia, porque estos mundos ideales los niños los hacen ellos solos, ¿no? Y estaba pensando que a lo mejor podría ser interesante la construcción, ¿no?, de este mundo ideal de forma colaborativa, ¿no? Con lo que planteas de que finalmente las literacidades no se hacen por uno solo, ¿no? Sino que se hacen de forma colaborativa, de forma intergeneracional. Entonces, ¿qué piensas, ¿no?, en ese sentido de sí expandir, ¿no?, como las reflexiones de los niños de forma colectiva y no quedarnos en una cuestión individual para después justamente trabajar también de forma colaborativa? Creo que es el enfoque, ¿no?
Yeah, sorry, what was the question?
O sea, ¿tú crees que podría ser interesante tener una definición individual de estos niños porque con lo que nos has estado hablando de forma colaborativa y colectiva, a lo mejor pienso que si nos quedamos en una cuestión individual puede ser un poco cerrada, justamente si estamos pensando que las literacias se construyen de forma colectiva. ¿No?
Yeah, I guess, are you saying that we should work more collectively or more individually?
Sí, creo que mi pregunta está mal planteada, ¿no? Pero más bien como, ¿cuál es la fuerza de trabajar las literacias en forma colectiva y no de forma individual?
Oh, yeah. So I think one of the things that I really love doing is working with children's as leaders. And a lot of the projects I've done have been in groups of about 6 children. We did a project called Feeling Odd in the World of Education. And within that 6, we did have some children who had individual ideas and they would go off and do individual things. And I think there is something about, they don't all think the same. But I also think if you can work in small groups of 6, there's another article that actually I haven't cited where we were talking about this as methodology of research creation and listening to children's different stories. I'll put that in the chat. And I think part of it is to think, how do you create spaces for young people to be heard and also to say things that they might not necessarily want to say in different ways? So research creation was my way of working with those very complex ideas of young people. So I suppose what I'm saying is that, yes, I do think sometimes young people have very complex concepts, and I think those conceptual framings are really interesting, but also quite different, and it takes a long time to kind of find that. So I'm just going to give you a link. I'm hoping that it will get to, this is the doing research creation in school, which has a more complex methodology for working with children and young people, where they were actually, their individual ideas came out. So I think that's, and that was through research creation, where they were co-researching through a co-research and research creation practice. If you can't find it, I can send it to you direct. And that was about children's experience of feeling odd in school. So I think that that's one of the ways we've done that, is not doing it collectively, but through this research creation. It's a process model that's about, they made films about being odd. So it's a kind of process model of research from sort of process philosophy.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. I'm going to Erika.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Mayra, for facilitating this discussion, and thank you, Dr. Pahl, for being here. As I was listening to you and to the question that Dr. Mayra made you about, so my question is, after the pandemic, I think we have the opportunity to reimagine everything, right? Reimagine, in particular, education, and reimagining how schooling goes. So I'm just curious to hear from you, how would you imagine how do you imagine schooling can be or should be if it wants to be a true liberatory space, right?
I think that's a really lovely question. What I do think is that the school we're working on with has got some very liberatory practices. One idea is that they learn in the forest for a day. So they spend a day in the forest. They also learn through concepts. And I think one of the things we've got to do is to push together the disciplinary parameters, like the science of carbon sequestration. That's what we're doing. We're getting the children to measure how much carbon trees take from the atmosphere. and then they're twinning themselves with the trees. So they're going to identify with the trees and then think, are my trees taking out this amount of carbon? So it's re-understanding the world we're in through the lens that we need, which is of climate change. So I think what we're going to need to do is to have different disciplinary tools almost to try to understand our world, which means mashing together these disciplines. And I think that we are in a really interesting space. And to be honest, I feel both hopeful and not hopeful. I think if we can learn how to bring those disciplines together with children as researchers, that's what we're trying to get them to do, is to be the researchers on the project. The children can then remake this world with that knowledge that they have of how to mitigate carbon. And it's a real challenge because the scientists that I'm working with are very gloomy about the world. You know, they say it's really serious, but at the same time, the children are the people who are going to have to sort it out. So they have to then find the resources. We've done a lot of work on hope. So the last time we went into the school, Samir and I and Johan, who's a philosopher, read a story of hope. And then the children wrote stories of hope. And we're working with this idea of practicing hope, and also Utopia as method. That's Ruth Levitas. And I think one of the things we're doing in our tree project is doing this idea of archaeological, this is quite hard, but it's archaeological, ontological, and architectural. So you look at the past, you look at where the being in the world now, I'll write it down, and then you look at building a new world, archaeological, ontological, and that's what we're doing in our project right now, and architectural modes. And we're trying to build by practicing hope. And that's actually, we're working a lot with the philosophical ideas from Ernst Bloch and from Ruth Levitas. So I think that's how we're trying to do it. It's interestingly, I think the teachers are quite excited by that. I think they want to do it. But it's also grounding it in the practice of learning about the trees, about the forest, and about what we need to do in the future, the way we need to be in the future.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. If there is no other question or participation, no? Because I saw that Monica write something, but you answer. No, so thank you, Monica.
Oh, I can put the details of the tree project in the chat because
yes.
I'll put the voice, I'll put the website, I can put the website, and I'd be really happy. We're right in the middle of it, so we've got a bit more time. It's a big project. It's 2 million, 3 years, 8 universities, 23 people, and it's been lovely to involve you in it. That's the project website. It's part of something called the UK Treescapes Programme, which is this idea that the UK wants to reforest a lot of, well, the north of England, basically. So we're reforesting this, and this project is part of the reforesting. So that's what it's part of the UK Treescapes project.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting, and we really need to do that in all the planets. Yeah. So if there is no other question or participation, we'd like to thank you to Dr. Kate Pahl to be here with us. We hope we can have her in the Congress or in another space and time, and share more about literacy. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. I've loved the discussion, and the questions were absolutely brilliant. I think I wasn't quite sure of the audience, but I'm very happy to share more things with you. I can share the slides. I've left my email on the slides, but you can also email me individually because I'm really interested in what you're doing and the kind of work that you're doing. So do keep in touch. For me, it's about finding more about what you're all doing as well. And I really like the questions about the future and hope and kind of new curriculum, because I think we are going to need to do that. So I'm really excited that that's something you're interested in as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And I'll send the PowerPoint as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Gracias a todos por estar aquí. Los vemos la próxima, en la siguiente conferencia, ¿no? Que esa será en español con el doctor Raúl Mora. Hasta luego.
Hasta luego, muchas gracias. Chao.
Chao.